Welcome to the Atlantic Council's event on Georgia's geoeconomic future. I'm Maia Nikoladze, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Economic Statecraft Initiative within the Geoeconomic Center. And something we do very well at the Geoeconomic Center is breaking down the silos between foreign policy and economics. And that's exactly what we are going to do today for Georgia. Georgia has gone through some domestic political turmoil this year, and that has also impacted Georgia's geoeconomic positioning. So today we will discuss solutions for Georgian people's economic empowerment, and to achieve that objective, I could not be more proud of the panel we have here with us today. To my right, Ambassador Daniel Fried. We are absolutely honored to have you, and we thank you for your continued attention to Georgian people and your support. Well, you really need no introduction, but you're former U.S. Ambassador to Poland and Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. What I admire so much about you is your work on NATO enlargement policy in your more than 40 years of government service, and also your view that Europe's prosperity needs the inclusion of Central Europe, Poland, as well as Eastern Europe. And I think that worldview is exactly what we need today among Western policymakers. So thank you so much for your time today. Next, we have Meurmishvili. Ia is CEO and President of Independence Avenue Media in DC, also former head of Georgia service for Voice of America. And something I did not know about you until recently is that you also own a winery in Georgia. So very much keeping close ties to Georgia even today. And you know, media is a very critical component in Georgia's democratic processes. So very happy to have your voice here. Last but not least, Lejava, who is Senior Policy Officer at Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and board member at Georgian Association in the USA. Anna leads engagement with civil society in Ukraine as well as Georgia. So I think your connections to civil society is important because that's also a very major player in getting Georgia back on the pro-European path. So with that, Ambassador Fried, in the past year, we've been picking up some signals from the Eurasia region on the economic side. So Russia's economic performance has been somewhat, weakening. At the same time, we've seen Armenia and Azerbaijan negotiating peace while excluding Russia, the traditional power broker in the region. At the same time, both of them have been deepening trading ties with the EU, and they have both seen that Russia has not helped Iran when the US bombed their nuclear sites, and Russia was also not able to help Syria, Assad regime in Syria stay in power. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan also have also been making deals with the US. Would you say that we could take these as a sign that the balance of power in Russia, in Eurasia, is tipping against Russia?
You could take these developments as a sign that the balance of power might tip against Russia, that there is potential for exactly what you're talking about. And the Trump administration has shown signs of recognizing it. Look, there is no point in asking the Trump administration to base its policy on a liberal world order or the expansion of the free world or democracy or anything like that. But there is a basis in Trump administration worldview for advocating a policy based on balance of power, hard interests, and in this case, Russia is a declining and vulnerable power. The United States has every interest in seeing that these countries develop in friendship with us rather than become dominated by China. And because the United States is far away, the Central Asian countries don't worry about us becoming a colonial hegemon. We're far enough away that we don't threaten them. We are strong enough that we might be able to help them. Now, the Azerbaijan-Armenia framework, I can't call it peace, we're not there yet, but it's a big step forward in the wake, of course, of Armenia losing the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Trump administration got involved, and in a very interesting way. What they were interested in is the corridor, the Trump corridor. They will put money into it. They will try to make money from it. Now, secret. This isn't new. The United States started thinking in these terms back in the 90s when it wasn't popular, and we've continued it since. But if the Trump administration is pushing this forward, more power to them. My point is that these are opportunities. And to take advantage of these opportunities in kind of hard, realpolitik, tough guy approaches, we need to mean it. And we need to push back at predictable Russian efforts to undermine what we're doing. So short answer is there's potential, but it won't happen without effort. All there is potential right now.
That's great, thank you. And would you say that so Russia's economic weakening is coinciding also with their incursions into Poland and wider Europe? So drone incursions I'm talking about. Do you think there is a connection there? Could it be either on the messaging side or otherwise?
Well, okay, old Stalinist saying, as the victory of socialism approaches, the resistance of the class enemy intensifies. Anyone of that generation will understand exactly what I mean, which is, if Russia feels itself vulnerable, their first instinct will be to make trouble and see whether they can stare us down or frighten us. That means we have to keep a steady hand, respond with toughness but not hysteria, and don't let the Russians intimidate the Europeans into caving, which is probably their objective. They will not succeed with the Poles, and they appear to be failing with the Danes. I think that the Russians don't quite understand the extent to which at least all the European countries that are on the Baltic Sea are really mad. They are angry in a way that I have not seen since the Cold War, and maybe not even then, because they feel under threat. So, yes, I think the premise of your question is correct. Russia is doing this to lash out, to get us to back off what it considers to be its proper empire. But just because they want it doesn't mean it will go their way. But success is not automatic. It will come to those who take advantage of the opportunities, and we need to do so.
Absolutely. And so as Ambassador Fried described, so we are seeing pushback in Europe, right, from the Poles, from the Danish. Does that mean that if Georgian authorities had the willingness to do so, now would actually be a good time to deepen economic partnership or otherwise?
The short answer to that would be yes, absolutely. And to come back to the point about Russia's diminishing influence in the region, I absolutely agree with Ambassador Fried that we are seeing that, but we also don't know if it's permanent. Let's look at the elections in Moldova. It was a great demonstration of Russia losing ground in Moldova, and everybody going into the elections, nobody knew what the outcome was going to be. Outcome was very clear. Moldovans chose West. Look at Syria, as you mentioned. Look at Iran, U.S. Operation in Iran's nuclear facilities. Russia and Iran are some of the closest partners at this moment in the war against Ukraine. But Russia did not do anything. It could not do anything because it's so overstretched due to all the things that it has to do with Ukraine and deal with some of the consequences that came about after its invasion of Ukraine. Armenia, Azerbaijan, same thing. U.S. at the end of the day took credit, which was due by President Trump, to President Trump. But at the same time, Russia was not even present. But also Georgia was not present, and that sort of like pivots us to Georgia's role in this. Georgia has historically been a mediator. Georgia has hosted, Georgia has negotiated release of Armenian prisoners, for example, or the POWs from Azerbaijan during Garibashvili's prime ministership. But when it came to this particular peace negotiations, Georgia was nowhere to be present. So while Russia's influence is decreasing in the region, I think Georgia is also kind of disappearing from as a regional player. And unfortunately, Russia's economic influence in Georgia is increasing. So, as you said, the opportunities are there. We see them. And it only, what's missing at this point is the will by the Georgian authorities to actually make a choice, because it is a matter of political will and political choice, to choose Europe over dependency on Russia economically and politically.
Absolutely. And since we're talking about economic dependence on Russia, and also you mentioned how Russia is thinly stretched in the region right now, Anna, who are other players in the South Caucasus and broader Eurasia region who could be competitors to Russia's economic influence?
First of all, I want to say thank you to you and Atlantic Council for shedding spotlight on Georgia during such an important time in country's history, and it's an absolute honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I have to also say that the views today are of my own and not the institutions that I'm affiliated with, but really happy to be here. To answer your question, frankly, there are a lot of different actors that have a potential to reap the benefits of economic opportunities in the region. But so far what we are seeing, that China has been the smartest when it comes to its policy approach to the region. Unlike the misconception that China has the largest footprint in the region, actually UK and European Union have had the largest foreign direct investment in Caucasus. Specifically, their relationship with Georgia and Azerbaijan has been quite strong. But what we are seeing, that China is not necessarily investing in direct equity investments, but has gained the large infrastructure contracts, which actually benefit Chinese companies and Chinese state and their political influence in the region. So to summarize, I would say, and speaking of the United States, this involvement in TRIP corridor and an agreement signed between Azerbaijan and Armenia is maybe a signal that the U.S. could be potential security guarantor in the region, since they have an economic interest now on. But I think there are more concrete policies needed from the EU and the U.S. to make sure that they reap the benefits. To sum up, I would say EU still, European Union and UK still have the capital in the region. United States has the credibility, and China has got all the contracts. So it's time to maybe revisit the approach to the region.
Yeah, and while EU is still largest investor in Georgia, Georgia's trading ties have been looking different. So EU-Georgia trade, I think it basically has gone almost to zero. Meanwhile, trade with Russia, China, as well as other sort of Central Asian countries has increased this year. So that contributes to Georgia's further economic isolation from the West. And another dimension of this sort of cutting ties has been the financial assistance, the stopping of financial assistance by the EU as well as the United States. The United States has also stopped its strategic partnership with Georgia, which was a major diplomatic setback, and there have been reports of the EU also reconsidering its association agreement. So that's another dimension of this, isolation that have come with Georgian Dream's actions and democratic backsliding. And so, yeah, we've seen the responses, right? They have mostly been economic in nature. And we also see what could come next, and that's also more economic restrictions. It's been, last time we were at the council, that was 1 year ago almost, and I think all these months have passed, and it feels like we're in a stalemate, right? So have these measures, right, the halting of financial assistance, has that changed anything on the ground? Have those changed Georgian Dream's calculations or actions so far?
Very good question. I don't think so. And I also, to be very direct, I think it's not the stalemate in Georgia or inaction, stalemate caused by the inaction or lack of action, or however you want to qualify Western actions taken against Georgian Dream government. But it's polarization and insulation of the elites from the society in Georgia. And we've seen some of that at every election. We're seeing that, we're witnessing that. We saw that on October 4th election, which was boycotted by half of the opposition parties. Half of them participated. Half of the municipalities did not even have the candidates to run against the Georgian Dream candidate. So the problem is not what the Western action, or the question is not the West is doing to support Georgia. The question is more like what the Georgians are doing to present alternatives to the Georgian society, which is very pro-democratic, pro-Western. Georgia is one of the biggest pro-American country in the region. It's always been one of the most pro-EU country in the region. It's always been. So there is clearly a disconnect between the actions of the EU and strategic sort of planning or strategic view of where the country could go with Western assistance, and the Georgian Dream's resistance to all of that the West is trying to do in order to maintain power and maintain the positions that they have. And if I may just add very briefly about Georgia's increased economic dependence on Russia. Since 2022, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Georgia's economic dependency on Russia has increased, despite everything else. Georgia is now more dependent on Russian energy sources than it was pre-war, and Russia represents roughly about 12%. Georgian trade is roughly about 10% with Russia, which is very high for Georgian economy. And we talked about the exports out of Georgia or dependency on the Russian market. And sorry for the prolonged response to this, but I think it's relevant to the conversation. In 2006, Russia imposed embargo on all Georgian agricultural goods, most, and wine. Wine was the biggest thing. At that time, Georgia for the first time, started diversifying its export markets for the agricultural goods, including Georgian wine. At that time, there were mass exports to the European Union countries, to the US, Asia, China, Japan. Russia reopened the market. And today, after pivoting away from the Russian markets, and after putting so much effort into increasing, for example, the quality of the Georgian wine, now we're back to the situation that 65% of the Georgian wine exports go to Russia. And this is not the highest quality. There are some good wines, of course, but it's not the quality that you would expect to have, for example, in Western markets. So that kind of dependency may create some temporary stability or short-term stability for the country's economy. We had a lot of capital flow flowing into Georgia after the invasion, as the Russian citizens had left Russia and brought their businesses. Some 20,000 Russian businesses are registered in Georgia since the full-scale occupation. That comes with it's peripheral issues. It's not just the Russian business. So Georgia is becoming more dependent, and its short-term economic growth we should say that the economy is growing, the currency is stable, but at the same time, the risks associated with depending on Russian market, on some of the Chinese investments, create a larger sort of challenge for the country's move towards the Western world.
You're discussing a very important point here, right? If we look at the numbers in GDP growth and exports and imports, that shows positive economic story. But then once you actually look into the effects, economic security and Georgia's economic vulnerability and exposure has increased. And as you said, in the long term, that's going to be a problem given Russia's historic trade weaponization against Georgia and other Eurasian countries. And we'll come back to the influx of Russian citizens and them opening up businesses later on. But before that, to go back to the idea of imposing restrictions. So there is a logic, right? That if you impose economic restrictions on a country, then its population will go against the government, and that could change in a regime, that could lead to a regime change. I think one missing element in that logic is that you also, at the same time, you need to empower those who want to make that change happen. I think right now, Georgia presents a unique opportunity to think about how this economic response and how economic tools should be designed. So I would love to, Anna, since your connections with the civil society in Georgia, what kind of help does Georgian civil society need right now from the West?
Absolutely, you're right. Sanctions on overall economy of Georgia will not motivate people to protest more than they're already protesting. People are extremely upset about what's happening, the direction that the country is going, and they're standing in the streets already over 300 days continuously since the protests began last November of 2024 after the several foreign agent law and transparency law and the grants laws were passed to limit the civic society's ability to really participate in civic life. At the moment, from what I'm hearing, the funding is truly running out because most of the organizations' accounts have been frozen. Many people, activists, have been jailed. At the moment, Georgia has more political prisoners per capita than Russia and Belarus. This is obviously really concerning statistics. And what they need is for the democratic community and international community to become as innovative as the authoritarian regimes themselves are. So they need the innovative ways of finance, whether it's cryptocurrency funding or whether it's an offshore funding where they receive funding in different countries and they use it in Georgia. They need some innovative ways of support. We also need to invest in media, as Ia already mentioned, and make sure that civic space remains open while this stalemate, or whatever we want to call it, lasts, and until we get to the next parliamentary elections. We cannot wait until the next parliamentary elections without strengthening the civil society.
Yeah, and to pick up on the media point, Ia, did you want to add on that?
Yes. And to all the restrictive laws and legislation that we saw for the past probably 3 years, but very much intensified in the past few months. One of them is about media financing, media in addition to the civil society financing. So Georgia is currently, it has diversity of voices in the media environment, but we don't know how long that will last, because the concern would be that all the opposing viewpoints to the Georgian Dream government would be silenced, whether it's through arresting people or cutting off funding or taking away the broadcast licenses through some technicalities. So we are facing, Georgia is facing that. And I think that's where I would echo what you said, Anna, that we need to come up with innovative ways to make sure that information flow, true fact-based journalism and information flows to the population. So one of the things that could be done is just identify the media organizations that can receive funding that would be adhering to the journalistic standards, not the propaganda, part of the propaganda machine, but really disseminate fact-based information. And there are some organizations like that in Georgia. Also create some mirror websites, for example, in case there is an issue with hosting somewhere else, just much like you talked about the financing. There are also, we should be able to use technology to support media, and one of those things is, for example, YouTube-based or video-based video-on-demand channels, which is basically you can connect your smart TV with a YouTube channel or some other video streaming channel. It doesn't have to be based in Georgia. It can be anywhere else as long as you have internet and smart equipment at the house, you can watch it. So there are multiple ways of doing it, and the investments are not that great into these things. So I think the information is the frontier in Georgia right now. And we need to ensure that for development and Western, moving the society forward towards the West, what Georgian society obviously wants, we need to defend information flow, and we need to ensure that there is a ethical, good journalism flowing still to the Georgian publics.
Absolutely, and also connecting sort of Georgian media to European as well, and funding of Radio Free Europe. The U.S. cutting assistance for that has been a major blow, and I think the EU to some extent stepped in, but doing more on that front would also help Georgia. So Ambassador Fried, to come back to the bring it home and talk about U.S. response specifically, and just one, I would like to get your take on, it seems like we're trying to achieve this dual foreign policy objective, right? There is the ruling party Georgian Dream, and to them it's clear that obviously they don't. The financial assistance should not be going to them, but at the same time, we do want to help Georgian people, and that seems like a difficult objective to achieve. But I was wondering if you could, what were your thoughts on that? If that's something that has been done in the past, and then finally, I think one of the major responses of the U.S. has been the Meurmishvili Act, but it's been held up in the Senate. So if you could discuss how it would be helpful to the Georgian people, and then why is it being held up in the Senate?
Meurmishvili is being held up because it's very hard to get things through the Senate right now. And although Meurmishvili Act has overwhelming support, technically the bill's managers are trying to get it through by unanimous consent, and one senator is holding it up. I will not defend that, but that's a fact. But you touched on something that I want to dive into. The Trump administration, as I said earlier, is interested in, let's say, the geoeconomics of the region, and for that reason entered into Armenia-Azerbaijan peacemaking, and maybe Trump also wanted to get credit for solving another conflict. But in any event, between peacemaking and geoeconomics, we are now a player in the South Caucasus. The arguments that have been made and that we have made here on this panel have been in traditional kind of post-Reagan arguments about freedom and America's interest to support freedom, and I agree with that. But it doesn't matter what I agree with. The Trump administration is less interested in that. They are interested not in abstract principles. In fact, J.D. Vance has expressed scorn for abstract principles. They are interested in hard economic interests. Now, you can construct a case for supporting the people of Georgia and a better future for Georgia on hard economic grounds. That is, a Georgia that is dominated by Russia and China is going to be less responsive to American interests and American investment, and less useful less useful for American business, less useful as a transit point for energy, just altogether less interesting for the United States. But we're going to have to make that case. And Georgia's friends will have to make a different kind of case. The other point is that it doesn't matter what kind of case Georgians' friends abroad make. The Georgian society has to develop for itself a narrative of its long-term resistance. And I can get into that because I remember this. I'm so old that I remember the 1970s and 1980s when this was done. And everyone thought it was impossible. The communism would never be overthrown, and it certainly wouldn't be changed by a bunch of intellectual dissidents. And the notion that workers would rise up was considered impossible. So there's another side to this story. But that having been said, of course, whether the American government under Trump is going to support free media for reasons of pro-democracy that I believe in or not, there are many ways in which that free media can be supported, and it needs to be. So I'm all in favor of that. I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying we have to work within the constraints of the Trump administration. Europe has its own instruments of free media support. And in addition to that, we have to develop another narrative of why Georgia matters, which the Trump administration can accept.
So to follow up on that point, I think it's easy to make a case that Georgia has a massive added geoeconomic value to Europe, right? It's that shortest trading route between Europe and China, and just to adopt that function would be valuable to the EU. So I think from the trade perspective, at least, it's a easy case to make. And I think in the past that would have normally also meant that that's also good for the U.S., right? But when you have sort of tensions between the EU and the U.S., does that complicate this task of coming up with?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. Wherever we land with the EU, we can easily come up with a common approach to areas like the South Caucasus. That's not the hard part. I'd like to develop an additional supplemental argument for why Georgia is important in addition to the one you raised, and that would be something like this. If I were speaking to the Trump administration, I would say thanks to Trump and his people who helped broker the next steps in Azerbaijan, Armenia, rapprochement, there is an opportunity for the United States and the West in general to advance its interests in the South Caucasus. Under those circumstances, if Georgia becomes a platform for Russian interference, hostility, and maybe worse, maybe aggression, that's not going to help us. You see where I'm going with this. It's true. Your narratives have to be based in truth, but they also have to be designed so that the political leadership you're trying to address will respond to it. And the arguments have to be true, and that's what we need to start thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned, making the arguments that will resonate, right, with the administration here. Big part of that is that in investment and business climate, and I'd like to pivot a little bit to that to that side of the story. Instead of creating a welcoming business environment, for Western investment, we've seen a very different type of shift. We've seen the influx of Russians, and Ia mentioned earlier how they have opened up 20,000 businesses. There is visa-free regime. They have no requirements to employ Georgians. So they are effectively locking Georgians out of the labor market, which in itself is an economic problem. So Anna, like that trend, that is a problem that impacts all Georgians regardless of their views about European integration or their political views. So in that case, would that be a case for the ruling party to actually do something about it? And which government entity should be taking action in this case?
It's a great question. I don't think the ruling party necessarily cares about the conditions of people on the ground. They're very much focused on their performance on the international indices. So let's say the high GDP growth numbers definitely boost their credibility in the way maybe in some populations in Georgia. Added to that, propaganda campaigns and misinformation convinces some small part of the population in Georgia, 20% or so, that this government is doing actually something right. But as you mentioned, the benefits that we have seen from this GDP growth have been reflected to the top 10% of Georgia's elites, business elites, who are quite connected with the current government. And some of the business elites are trying to remain silent or apolitical, not to lose their interests and their businesses. So we are seeing growing inequality for sure due to the current government's policies. We see major brain drain. A lot of people, especially since last November, have left the country, and these are the working age population, so demographics are going to be really challenging in Georgia moving forward as well. And we are seeing that the government really doesn't care about actual sustainable economic development, but rather the performance on these international indices, temporary performance.
And I don't think there is that much attention on this issue, right, within Georgia or also like outside. You can disagree with me, but would you say that just more attention from media or think tanks could help Georgians mobilize to demand fairer access?
I think Georgians are mobilized. As Anna mentioned, there's a nonstop or for 320, over 300 days of consecutive days, there is a demonstration. In some cases, it's a smaller demonstration. In other cases, it's tens of thousands, if not a couple hundred thousand people in the streets. So Georgian society is mobilized. That mobilization and the demands of the people need to be channeled somehow, so the government then is reactive and responsive to the demands of this particular demonstrations, for example. But unfortunately, the situation is that there is this like dual reality that's happening in Georgia right now, because of polarization and because of government's efforts to make sure that attention is not paid to these protests that have been going on for a year. So I do agree with you that we need to pay attention. It needs to be publicized that there are all these injustices happening in Georgian economy. There is a cover-up, there is a propaganda, there is disinformation, all to create this veneer of stability in the country, where maybe there is sort of peace in Georgia, like there is no hot war happening in Georgia, but Georgia's 20% is occupied by Russia. Russia is continuing the borderization. Russia is continuing kidnapping and arresting Georgian citizens on the Georgian soil. So, yes, there is peace, but there is no stability in Georgia. And I think the highlighting from the media organizations, both international and domestic, I think international is an important part of it, highlighting dependency and dangers of dependency on Russia and isolation from the West is actually reinforcing that political capture of the Georgian state at the moment that we're seeing, which in my view is going to intensify. So I do agree we need to pay attention, we need to talk about that, and there should be an alternative from within Georgia that people are presented to say that, okay, well, I prefer this path over this one, but that path needs to be visible and tangible for people, for society.
Yeah, having more business ties with the West would help with that. But yeah, the unfortunate reality is this influx of Russians and just their worsening inflation, also inequality. Real estate owners might be benefiting in Georgia, but wider population is not. And so, Ambassador Fried, like there is that labor market problem, the inequality, economic issues, but beyond those. Influx of Russians in Georgia, do you think that's also a national security, potentially sanctions evasion risk?
Well, a lot of the Russians who showed up in Georgia showed up because they wanted to be out of Russia and felt Georgia was a safer place, culturally familiar. So many of them decent people. However, your larger point is correct. We know from, let us say, 20th century European history that there are probably lots of agents of the Kremlin they're ready to do the Kremlin's bidding, and they may form a kind of alliance with the regime against the Georgian opposition. We're circling an interesting issue, which is what narrative will the Georgian people respond to. And it doesn't matter what I say or anybody says in the West. What arguments will the Georgian people respond to? Now, it is a general rule that corrupt governments dependent on foreign support usually don't deliver the best for their people. I'm thinking Yanukovych in Ukraine, okay? There's some similarities here, right? That narrative needs, it might help if that narrative came from a united opposition. Now, I'm not a Georgian. I'm not part of the opposition. But I do notice that they feud and that they seem to be as mad at each other as they are at the regime sometimes. I remember in old Eastern Europe, the democratic oppositions went from nationalist to social democrat and everybody in between. These were incompatible groups, but in opposition, they were united. After they had achieved power, they split into constituent parties. But their narrative was a combination of national patriotism and democracy and national sovereignty. That was a narrative from the Baltics to Bulgaria, strongest in the Baltics and Poland, Hungary in happier days, and in Czechoslovakia. Developed thinking, right? That kind of a narrative was developed inside the country. It wasn't from outside. Now, Putin thinks there's no opposition, it's all a US operation. But he would think that, and he's completely wrong. He thinks the color revolutions were our doing. My doing, as I've been told. Nonsense, nonsense. We're not that good. We're not that smart. The Georgians are not used to this. They've grown up in a relatively liberal society ever since the Rose Revolution and even before. That's now gone. And they have to find both new ways tactically to adjust to the current reality, but also a way to present a narrative that will go beyond their immediate circle. Okay? There's the story of the Polish opposition, a story I know well, is a story of how the democratic intellectuals and much larger, more powerful Polish working class were completely misaligned, but found a way to align themselves. And it was Lech Wałęsa who helped do this, but years before, there's a great moment when there are worker riots in 1976. And their workers are mad and they're torching the Communist Party committees. And one of the leaders of the democratic opposition who was trying to reach out to the workers gave a famous speech in which he said, "Don't burn the committees, form your own." Form your own. He was reaching out beyond the Warsaw, Gdańsk, Kraków circle of intellectuals to workers. And the narrative of freedom, democracy, our nation, and therefore a better economic future for us all took hold. You see where I'm going with this. Don't pay attention to what I'm saying. The Georgians have to find the answer. But my point is that the Poles, the Baltics found the answer on their own. And it was an answer that united the political opposition that was incompatible ideologically, but they didn't care. They knew it, but they didn't care. And united them with people who were working class, village people, and it was successful, so much so that these are no longer poor countries, right? They're not poor countries. That's powerful. And I am the last person who's going to tell Georgians what to do. I'm just describing historical lessons that they can draw from in their own way, and they will do it their own way. But that's what they need to do under the current circumstances, seems to me, as an old guy who witnessed some good history.
No, that's it. It is Georgians' job to do that, for sure.
Yeah.
And not to come up with excuses or anything.
No, go on.
But I think with the narrative formation, I think Russian disinformation is something that, that it intervenes quite a lot in that space. And even in the past, past 2 years, the introduction of the foreign agent law, right? Like when they take actions that are very clearly anti-democratic, then the narrative is developed around it very quickly that says, well, if we don't do this, there is a larger security threat from Russia. So I think they are good at playing with the narratives, and I'm not sure if it's a technical or a psychological work that needs to be done on our end, but I do think that that's just something that intervenes heavily. So it's not Georgians in a vacuum. You've got sort of Russian methods there, right?
Yeah, you're quite right. Everything you say is right. But people will respond to the reality around them. They will respond to the reality of corruption, inefficiency, declining services, right? I mean, what propelled the Rose Revolution in the first place? It was the fact that you had to pay a traffic cop a bribe, once a week, right? Or more. That nothing worked. That heating was always a crisis in the winter. Remember those days? People you don't, you're too young.
No, I do remember. I was 5'6".
I mean, even I know that, right? Even I know that, the outsider here, the non-Georgian. The Russians will have the inside track because of disinformation, but people aren't stupid. And they will respond to reality. And the ability of endless manipulation works until it doesn't. Plus, Georgians will be better at countering the narratives. And they will use their own techniques. After all, in the communist period, there was 100% monopoly of TV, radio, and newspapers, 100%. And yet, people knew what the truth was. As a general rule, we as societies, and this is all over the world, it applies to the United States also, have not developed the skills to read social media in a discerning way. We're all suckers. But we used to be suckers for the boulevard press, the yellow journalism, right? Or pamphlets in the 18th century. And people learn over time to read and think in a discerning way. The trouble is there's a lot of damage done in the meantime, right? I don't mean to minimize it. I don't mean to say it's easy. But the notion that it is hopeless is simply ahistoric. And since we're in IMF and World Bank week, I will say that the economy is going to drive things because people will respond to their lived experience. You mentioned the indices and the big numbers. Well, yeah, but people will respond to how it looks on the ground to them. And they're not stupid. They are going to know that their lived experience is real. The bad news is that it takes time. Okay? And it's the job of the United States for, take Trump's and Trump world's geostrategic hard arguments. If those arguments result in the United States helping Georgia remain free, then time may start to work for the Georgian people once again. Anyway, easier said than done, I realize.
I'll just respond to that. I would say that majority of Georgian population is not manipulated. They exactly know what their lived experience is. They know that they want to live in free and independent Georgia, having access to the EU and other international actors. I think the issue is that they need more international support and messaging, that the international community is there to defend those values that the international system had depended on for the past 80 years since the World War II. And I think that's really important. And I do have to say that Ambassador Fried, you mentioned why Georgia is important. Georgia, I was just reading, didn't know that the 10% of all global critical minerals apparently come from Central Asia and Caucasus, which I really didn't know. And at the moment, China is most invested in the extraction of these resources from the region. That could be another entry point for international businesses in Georgia. But in order to, as you said, establish environment where the Western companies enter Georgia and other countries in our region, we need a democratic government that is transparent, that has a rule of law, so the companies can be protected. And I think that narrative is very well understood in Georgia. The issue is that there are not many levers in which they can use to gain back. Only lever is really the democratic elections, and elections have been rigged. So the issue is that what other processes, and nobody wants revolution in Georgia. People do not want, I mean, there's some extremist groups on the ground, but really the majority of people want to change the government through democratic means. So what, beyond the elections, what are the levers that we can change the situation in Georgia? And I think that's maybe an ongoing question that we should answer all together.
Yeah, I agree, because you made an interesting point about the whole idea of imposing economic pressure, right? Or people, if they feel economic disadvantages, they will fight against the regime. But then you got Belarus, right? They have been under authoritarian regime for 30 years, and they know what their economic situation is, but they cannot fight back because they just don't control the police or all the critical like levers of power. So that's another challenge. Like even sometimes they use the argument of it's 21st century. If people are economically inconvenienced, like they will make the change. But then even in 21st centuries, we have countries where people cannot do anything, against the oppressive regime. So that's very much ongoing discussion. But to your point, and Anna has a good point about critical minerals, I think that is something to develop further.
Perfectly good argument.
Yeah.
Perfectly good argument. Look, if you're right about Georgian people, you've got a lot to work with, and Georgia has a lot to work with. And the memory of the Russo-Georgian War, the history of Georgian independence before 1922, all of those are part of Georgia's historical memory. I mean, every time I go there, people talk to me about that. So there is hope. It's good to have the world view out there of the liberal democratic order, but just remember you've got the Trump administration now, so you won't have quite the same messages. But Georgians, that kind of self-salvation is going to come from within anyway. And Europe is still there. And in the United States, I think we will find our way back to our roots. We always do.
And I hope that the generation that grew up in Bassiani clubs and are, really used to freedom, I really have hope in them, and that we're not going to give up. Especially the women have been such at the forefront of every protest and such leaders in the civic movement. And I think that's another point, that maybe opposition is not coordinated, but society and the civic movement is quite coordinated, and they have really a one message at positive change in Georgia.
Yeah, and I would add to that Georgia is a European country. Georgians are Europeans. If anything, I would argue that they are one of the first Europeans. And that's a topic for a different conversation. And with that, it's not just the location, it's also the spirit of the people. Georgians are some of the freest people, at least that I know, in the world. So I think free societies and free people always prevail. In some cases, it may not be guaranteed. In some cases, it may take a lot of time. But as long as that desire to be free, independent, and just continue the European path, I think there is room in Georgia, with support of the younger generation, for the country to reorient itself, hopefully at the same time as the U.S. does at some point.
And on that positive note, we have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to ask you for some specific next steps, right? So the U.S. does not have an ambassador to Georgia right now.
Right.
How long do you expect that vacancy to last, and what should be the first steps of U.S. ambassador to Georgia once they're appointed?
I have no idea when there'll be a U.S. ambassador to Georgia appointed. But I want to make one point. During the period of communist-dominated Europe, we did have relations with the communist governments. We also had them with independent society, especially starting in the late 70s and the 80s. Okay, under Brzezinski, Carter Brzezinski and Ronald Reagan. Often I hear from admirable people in the Georgian opposition that Western embassies should have no contact whatsoever with the government because they hate the government, because the government is awful in many ways. Okay, so stipulated. But that's not the fight I would make, okay? The issue is not whether we should have contact with the government, but whether we will continue to have contact, despite the government, with independent civil society. Those are different questions. So if I were giving advice to the ambassador, I would tell the next U.S. ambassador, I would say, you need to develop the ability to talk to the government without being their patsy, but without screaming at them. And you need to talk to civil society without taking sides, but speaking on the basis of principles. All right, this is terribly corny, but I'm going to say it anyway. Abraham Lincoln said that Jefferson's principle in the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal. That's the language they used. They used men back then. All men are created equal applies to all men and all times. All men and all times. Universal values. And my advice, and I'm a broken record on this, is remember that is our founding American creed, and the ambassador should remember that, even as you work the individual issues and work with the government. Make clear it is known where you stand.
That's a good advice. Hopefully we have an ambassador soon. But Anna and Dia, so in the very few time we have left, I think it's clear that the civil society is something that sticks out, and just people-to-people ties between Georgia, Europe, and the U.S. So if you could have some policy recommendations, what could be done to just expand those people-to-people ties between Georgia and the West? Anna and Dia.
That's a great question. Actually, we have seen the growing number of Georgians going to Russia and China to study. So I think it's important that U.S. invest in some of the programs and projects that have been ongoing, like Fulbrights and other scholarships to bring Georgians to the United States, to EU. I think that's really important to continue that. And also some innovative ways of partnership between civil society here and civil society in Georgia. But I think there is definitely room to maneuver. There's a lot of hope still. And I just want to thank all our colleagues and friends in Georgia who are still protesting and fighting for a good fight.
Same recommendations, basically continue the educational programs, be more engaged, especially in the regions, because I think the regions are a little neglected. Tbilisi, Kutaisi, larger Batumi, larger cities do have younger people, do have more opportunities, but greater engagement, whether it's through online engagement or having mini scholarships, the State Department had. We'll see if some of those programs continue, but let's say IVLP programs where the Georgian Georgians of different walks of life were brought to the United States to get them introduced to how things are done in the U.S. So continuing some of them, I think, would be absolutely essential. And when I feel like when there are more restrictions to restrict people to interact with the outside world, more you see the desire to get engaged with the outside world. So once the Georgians do that, and Georgians are already doing it, I do hope that the West sort of extends the hand and just it will be, the effort will be mutual.
We'll hope so. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from you today, and hopefully this will start conversations about how we can talk about Georgia's economics, foreign policy in the same context, and deepen engagement between Georgia and Western societies. Thank you so much. Thanks to our audience. So at 5 p.m., tune in here to watch the last event of the IMF World Bank Week, which will discuss key takeaways from the week. So yeah, stay tuned, and thank you for joining us today.